Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core podcast. I'm UrzaMaster, joining me as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby. We are venturing out again on that 5-year mission that only took 3 years because we go quick in that unexplored part of our Alpha Quadrant with the gallant crew of the USS Enterprise NCC 1701 in an episode of Season 3 that could best be described as brown. But without further ado, I'm going to set this over to Fert Derby for some background on an interesting entry into Star Trek's original series.
Thank you, UrzaMaster. Thank you, Lord Uther. Thanks, Warp Core fans, for making us your number one destination on the internets for your Star Trek knowledge, wisdom, and entertainment. Make sure you're checking out the archive because we've been through the Alpha Quadrant and we've gone through many time zones and time eras and periods already. We've been to the distant past and the far-flung future, and who knows where we'll land next. Right now, we are in year 3 of the 5-year mission. This is Day of the Dove. It is the November 1st, 1968 episode. It was directed by Marvin Chomsky. This is his second turn behind the camera. He previously did And the Children Shall Lead Them, which we covered in Warp Core 69, which is the one with the personal injury attorney playing a glowy green alien who gets the minds of the children to torment and harass the Enterprise, which many of you Graying Jedi fans tuned in to look at on the archive based on our views. Thank you for joining us on that episode. And this is Marvin's sophomore effort. We also have writer Jerome Bixby, not to be confused with the Incredible Hulk's Bill Bixby, which is every time I see the name Bixby, that's what I think of first. Jerome has worked before in season 2 of the original series. He gave us the instant classic Mirror Mirror, which we wrote about and talked about in Warp Core 47. And By Any Other Name, which this episode bears a little bit of similarity to in some regards, and we ran over that in Warp Core 61. This is kind of the last episode of Star Trek now that we've lost our returning champion directors and our showrunners DC Fontana and Gene L. Kuhn are kind of been pushed aside except for a few lone credits here and there. We're going to start seeing a lot of new voices in the writer's room and a lot of new faces behind the camera for directing. This is kind of the last episode where you have a real continuity with what has come before. So strap in, because it's about to get really wild here. You thought the first few episodes of season 3 were up and down. Just you wait. But we would also be remiss if we did not note the participation and the vocal tenor of actor Michael Ansara, who plays Kang the Klingon in this episode. He made such an impression that he would later reprise this role for DS9 and Star Trek Voyager in later years. And in particular, the DS9 episode Blood Oath. When we get to that, obviously, we will say our piece. But that is a great hour of television, no matter what side of the fence you're on, from DS9's oeuvre, and worth checking out. Blood Oath. And Michael Ansara got to replay this very role of Kang. The Klingons have evolved in their makeup. They're getting closer to what we would expect from the big screen franchises and subsequent series. Remember, initially when they were introduced, they just kind of looked like folks. But now the heavy eyebrows, the darkened skin, the military short hair, and so forth. They still haven't nailed the Klingon female just yet in terms of settling on a final look. But certainly the warriors now are looking a little more Klingonish So the good props to the makeup department for doing that there. Gentlemen, I'm really going to defer early to you guys to let you help set the tone for how you took this episode. This is like a Clint Eastwood picture. I mean, we're getting good, bad, and different. I won't say ugly. I'd say the good, the bad, and the abrupt. It's an episode that, unlike our other podcast, The Graying Jedi, where we talked about resolving threads and sealing them off, this episode kind of leaves. Sorry, I thought I was going to sneeze. It kind of leaves a huge plot question dangling at the end. Namely, what do you do with a ship full of Klingons after you've destroyed their ship and you've spent the episode at each other's throats? There's a coming together, not unlike Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, where everyone seemingly is on the same page. But how long can that last, gentlemen? How long before the mirth and the merriment subsists and it's back to, we're going to take over your ship and slit your throats? And the episode, either to its credit or its detriment, does not really answer that question. And so it ends kind of on a, as opposed to just even having a little captain's log. We've dropped the Klingons off on a nearby world and we're continuing our mission, kind of a, I mean, I don't know. It was odd. It was an odd way to sort of just end it, if you will. Yes, the storyline for the episode had been resolved, but there were quite a few things there saying, yeah, so what's to stop Kang now from grabbing a sword and running Kirk through? There were some very good things about it. And there were some things on it that, for me, an outwardly racist McCoy certainly gave me pause. Another episode emphasizing Chekhov, where Inspector of the Gun, he got to romance the town trollop. And here he goes off on a mission to avenge his brother, which may or may not have been playing with canon, depending on how you read the episode. We got to see George Takei with the sword. We got to see everybody with a sword. They became standard issue Starfleet weaponry in this episode. I think this is one where the premise really sounded good in the room. And I have to give Jerome Bixby and the team credit for, again, trying to reimagine what Star Trek in the late 60s is possible. What can we do? But like I say, let's hear where you guys went with it, because I think that this one just kind of was weaving through
Urza,
the.
do you mind if I
start? Take this one away, Lord Uther.
Yeah, I'm going to, because as always, Fert Derby brings up excellent points. I was very frustrated with this episode because I think it was a great idea that was executed poorly. And here's why. You could have expanded the Federation Klingon lore or built it up a little bit more with this episode, but to Fert Derby's point, I felt like the episode ended too quickly, where they could have taken that time, or they could have cut out some of the shenanigans going on during the episode and built up the tension even more, or maybe you force them to work together, which I guess is kind of what happened. But at the end, like they could have, to me, it felt like at the end, there was no more Klingon Federation issue. Everything's fine. Like, it's all going to work out in the long run. And I think you could have put some kind of a twist in there and, maybe, again, had 10 minutes at the end there that they could have built that up a little bit better. So that was really my frustration, is they could have done so much more with it, which kind of seems like to be the theme for this season, is frustration, big ideas, lazy writing. So again, I don't know if that's a writing issue, if with what winds up happening there. But I feel like it's also the first time. Is it the first time that we get consistent Sulu Chekhovness in an episode where they're both there consistently?
Yeah.
Like they actually had money in the budget for it this time around or something. I don't know. So again, that's my overall issue with this episode, is huge huge potential. Could have done more with it, but kind of seemed to squander the opportunity that was there. UrzaMaster.
I mean, we've kind of had this episode before with Triskelion, and it's the same concept, just played out slightly differently, which again would have been okay. All powerful being brings them together, puts them in this state of constant conflict because that's what the being feeds off of. I like it, but there are some real hard misfires on this one. I like the idea that the Klingons, have a measure of success, and it's like, oh, are they going to take over the Enterprise? And then they figure out, like, oh, we're being manipulated. We have to figure out now how to work together. I like all that. And I do feel like there was more they could have done to work towards that and build bridges, but instead they just kind of slathered on, and I like the idea that this is lazy writing. They slathered on some heavy racism, and I mean this in the sense of like humans versus Klingons. I think there are other implications of like the makeup and stuff you could draw, but I don't know that that was intentional necessarily, especially of the era. I think it paints the crew of the Enterprise and it paints the Federation in a weird light, because you get this really heavy hatred of Klingons, which has not really been justified. I mean, some of the earlier episodes, it's like, okay, they were at war and there's like a brief truce, or that the war's been over for a little bit. So you get a little bit of that and there's some hangover there. This one like paints it as like there's this vicious hatred of each other, which I don't think there really should be, to the point where like Chekhov at one point is about to brutalize the female Klingon, which again, this is the second time this has happened in Star Trek thus far. And it's like, I mean, granted, they cut it off well before the whole Uhura thing, which was implied and off screen. This is way, in my words, way more graphic. And I like how they changed Klingon females in Next Gen, because it really, for a Klingon, it painted her as quite helpless, and more of a conniving entity than anything, which it really did to some extent make the Klingons seem like maybe they were just more simplistic and warlike, but instead, they're supposed to be like conniving, great warriors. This makes them, I don't know, it paints them as lesser, which, if anything, they should be equal or greater than in terms of war, which we get in later series of Star Trek, and it's done so much better. So it just feels like they're just trying to demonize these Klingons, and then our Enterprise gallant crew comes to the realization they're being manipulated, and they're like, oh, well, we have to educate them. We have to civilize them, basically. And that, again, just feels pretty racist. And it's like, what story are we really telling here? And then there's the whole goofy, like, oh, if we laugh together. And then at the end, it's like, exactly, the bulk of the issues remain unresolved. Like, you've taken care of the immediate threat. This feels like an Act 1 that never quite got to the latter half of what it should have been. And it reminds me of that episode where they're on the planet with the primitives who are like all married to the U.S. Constitution, and the rogue Starfleet captain who's leading the Huns, and it's like this. All this feels like is like cheap heat. Basically, it's a lot of cheap heat, and it's painting a picture which does not paint the United Federation of Planets in a good light at all. And they're supposed to be sort of the saviors, but it really comes across as like this is just sort of a racist divide with no resolution and no hint at a greater intent behind this. Like, I don't know if Roddenberry went over this episode, but I feel like this strays pretty far from his vision.
To your point, so here's what I wrote down. I wrote down, so this is the question I'm going to ask you guys. So you're going to take the writer's chair, okay? Because I wrote down, I feel like I've seen this episode before. And then, so here's my question to both of you as writers. Was there a way to do this episode without the alien being involved? So I want you to pitch to our millions and millions of Warp Core fans, what would you have done, or what could you have done as writers to make this happen, taking the alien out of it? Because just like Data is the catch-all in Next Gen, whenever they can't figure something out, they use Data some way, in a sense. I feel like the alien, the concept of an alien, great, this godlike aliens causing all this mischief. So I want you to get the Klingons into this situation without the alien. One of you, I don't care who, tell me how.
So if that's the assignment, um, you have a Klingon cruiser and the Enterprise sort of facing each other down, a la Search for Spock. Both ships could blow each other out of the stars, but right now their fingers are on the trigger, but nobody's pulling. And then you switch all of this action planet side, and what you have instead of a glowy alien, which reminded this viewer, just to date myself, of a 1979-1980 Buck Rogers space vampire episode in which the space vampire bops around as a glowing red dot, which at the time was probably the pinnacle of special effects for network television in that era. But fine, we'll lose the little glowy blob, which also, to its credit, at least they didn't try to like give it a voice. At least like it was just kind of, it was alien, like in the truest sense. Like you couldn't understand it, reason with it, or so forth. You just had to kind of analyze it and then try to figure your way out of the situation, which, as I agree with UrzaMaster, let's just share a good laugh and you get off my ship. No. But the better version is put all this action on the planet. Just have the ships facing each other off tensely. Don't have the Enterprise blowing it up and then they're stuck with a hold full of Klingons. And then have what's affecting them not necessarily be an alien intelligence or something like that. Have it be an atmospheric reaction that initially doesn't show up on the tricorders. Like it isn't like it's toxic, but there's something on the planet, an environmental cause, if you will. You could have even done a whole ecology, environment kind of thing, pollution, whatever you wanted to do, that affects the chemistry. And so therefore they're stabbing each other and phasering each other, but they don't die. And it's the planet that's causing this uncertainty and so forth. I think when you take it off the ship and you put them on sort of an even neutral ground, then some of that unresolved issues that we're talking about feel less. I mean, the Enterprise, and that they just get back on their ships and leave. Like I think the problem was stranding several hundred Klingons on the Enterprise. And then, as Cody said, once the laughter dies down, it's like, so now what do we do? That being said, this episode gets off to its strong start because Kirk pulls a Star Trek II Wrath of Khan double cross. It's brilliant in its simplicity. It's like, beam us all up. We will take your ship, Kirk, you coward. And here, I'll slap you in the face. And then, he sends a signal to Spock. Spock, widen the beam and get us all. And then he's, secretly fiddling with his communicator. Spock gets the signal and says, fascinating. And then they're all trapped in the transporter beam. And for goodness sakes, leave them there. We've seen in Strange New Worlds that Dr. Mbenga was keeping his daughter alive in a transporter buffer for years while he worked on a cure to save her. We covered that, by the way, on our Strange New World Warp Core podcasts. Be sure you check those out. That was, I actually smiled and clapped on my couch when that moment happened. I'm like, well, there you go. You got the Klingons. Now figure out what the heck is going on. But instead, it's like, all right, let's let them go. And we'll put them in the employee lounge, et cetera. It's like they kind of were asking for it. So yes, I think I want to give credit to DeForest Kelley for again being, and I don't mean for this episode because I'm not giving him credit for this episode, but I don't blame him for that. I blame possibly the writing more so. He's great. and he's consistent like Leonard Nimoy. But it was a little histrionic in this one with the naked racism. It's not the McCoy we're comfortable seeing, and obviously it's being influenced from outside forces, so we can excuse it. But overall, in the episode, as you're watching it and taking it in, it's not a real pleasant thing. A rapey Chekhov also, especially for a character that we're still kind of trying to warm to. I mean, he's a guy on the bridge with the monkey's haircut and the funny Russian accent. Like, we don't have a lot of building blocks with him as we've seen with Spock, or Kirk, or even to some extent McCoy. So to make him cross that line or brush right up against that line of actual villainy, that's a little, sort of uncomfortable there. But to Lord Uther's credit, we do get a full helping of Chekhov and Sulu here, interacting with each other and separately and working cogs of the Enterprise bridge crew. So that was there. Scotty got that haircut. And so I was relieved to see that. No more of that strange Scottish pompadour that he'd been sporting in early episodes, and so forth.
Hold on. Urza, make this episode happen without the alien.
I think we've already gotten this before. Well, I will say we get this in the future. For us, 2024, we've gotten this before, this exact story. And one way to solve it, and I have another way they could have done this, and I'll go through that. But they did this on Next Gen. They put Geordi on a planet with a Romulan, and they had to save each other from basically the weather, and then find a beacon despite physical injuries and being near death, while the Enterprise was in a full-on standoff with a Romulan warbird. And then your resolution was, they actually built some bridges together. Geordi ends up helping to save this Romulan's life. They send the Romulan back and they avert war. I think that's how you tell this episode the right way, frankly. No aliens, just purely circumstantial exploration, which again is the whole mission, right? They are not a war ship. And for whatever reason, they keep trying to force that in some of these episodes. If you wanted to do this exact sort of Klingon crew is aboard the Enterprise, and there's a standoff, there's some sort of a fight for control of the ship, I think the setup works okay. You get a wounded Klingon bird of prey, out there. Maybe it's adrift, and clearly it's been in either some kind of battle or some kind of an accident. I think a battle works if you want to have an alien, but if you don't, let's just say it's a warp core breach, and it didn't go completely off, so the ship is dead in space, and their life support is going to fail. The crew is somewhat okay, but many of them maybe need medical attention. Beam them all aboard. This is your goodwill mission that you should be doing. And again, Next Gen does this several times, but original series really didn't. And of course, this is where you can build that history of, hey, we all fought in the war against the Klingons. This is very still fresh in our memories, and you can have that expository Kirk with Chekhov, or Kirk with McCoy, or Kirk with Scotty, or some variation of, the brain trust in the ready room. And they're like, why are we saving these Klingons? They did such and such at the battle of such and such. And, 3 to 5 minutes of the episode could be spent on, we just rescued all these people. Now the Doctor is doing his best to save these people who were our enemy not that long ago. Like, how do we know we can even trust them to be civil during their stay while we're trying to get them back to Klingon space or to a starbase, whatever. And then, turns out that, like, despite the fact that they're getting cared for, some of the more unscrupulous Klingons band together to usurp the Enterprise as like as we see in some of the Star Trek films. Like, they're always after the Enterprise for glory, right? They want to regain their glory that they lost in the war. And now the Enterprise crew is caught off guard because they're trying to be the good guys. They're trying to do the right thing. But this band of Klingons, maybe led by their captain, or maybe their captain's incapacitated and it's like a first officer. And so the doctor has to rush to try and get their captain back to health so he can straighten things out as a superior commanding officer. Meanwhile, our crew is fighting in the halls or, losing deck after deck to this Klingon crew. And it's at this standstill moment where it's like, either we're going to kill each other or we're going to find a way out. And then the doctor wakes up the captain and the captain's like, you saved my life. They bring the crews together and they see like, this is how we like move away from our warlike, adversarial relationship. You can condense that into a half hour, 45 minutes TV pretty easy. Again, it's 3 to 5 minutes of exposition in the first act. You get the second act where everything's ramping up to this fever pitch. Your third act is reviving their captain. Captain to captain, they work this out between the two of them, and then, it's not a surrender of the Klingons. You're not defeating their, supremacy or defeating their adversarial relationship even, but you're giving it some context of like, okay, this is why we're going to let this slide this time. And then you get them to another Klingon cruiser and there's like that tense sort of, return to us the crew of the blah, blah. And it's like, okay, here you go. And that's it. Like, it's still tense. You've protected the Klingons as like this adversary / sort of villain. But at the same time, you're protecting that UFP sort of good guy status. You don't have to be racist. You don't have to have a sexually brutal scene. And you could even have like a love interest for Kirk in there with a Klingon female, which I think would have been, come on, it's the original series. It would have been great and expected. You could have done all that in a much nicer way, which I think is truer to Roddenberry's vision than whatever this was. So that's, if you're not going to do this, the smaller factor of a one-on-one Geordi and Romulan, do something where it's like the Enterprise is trying to do the right thing despite their, misgivings about helping Klingons. It goes sideways and they have to get themselves out of it. That is a very easy formulaic. At this point in time, it's cliche. It's cliche because Next Gen did it so well, like 8 times. They could have done it here. And it really feels like a miss because they did. You could still do an Alien. I'm not saying that. Like that really didn't upend it. Like, you could have the Alien do this and still do all that same stuff. And have it be like a toxin or a contaminant or a psychic control that pits these two against each other. And then the captains have to come together despite the fact they don't like each other and remedy the situation. You could have still done that and done it to a much more successful degree. But I agree. Lazy writing, lack of budget. They're trying to fill up a time slot that's just not, to a certain extent, I feel like they didn't care. And that really kind of smacks as a fan.
That's a 7. And that's what you just pitched. That's the episode that in the multiverse, I hope someone makes back in 1968. So you're getting 7 out of 7 Warp Cores, UrzaMaster, for that off the cuff reading of Klingon crew versus Enterprise crew versus Wake Up the Captain. Bravo. That was something right there. That's not what this episode's going to get, but yours gets a 7.
Hey, Paramount, you're watching. I could use a side gig. But Fert Derby, what is your Warp Core rating for this episode?
Oh, hell. I'm not in a vindictive mood for Star Trek. I don't want to punish them. I don't feel this episode was inept. I just think that we left a lot of money on the table, literally. But at least the sets were finished. This one go around, they didn't have this weird half-completed Enterprise like engineering sets and the like. Let's go 3.5. When you give something a 4, you're basically saying that it met a bar, even if the bar was lowered. I'm going to go 3.5 on this one, just because like there's just so much that you're still kind of wondering. I mean, even diehard Star Trek fans in 1968 were probably wondering as the Enterprise pulls away and the blue credits for the end of the show go, there, wait, is that it? Like I can see people in 1968 say, "Honey, what the heck just happened?" So I think it's 3.5 for me. I think 4 at least says you stuck some sort of landing a little bit, a couple of bobbles. This one did not hit the landing.
Lord Uther?
That's my exact number is 3.5 because they put half of their effort and heart into it, had half of a good story, and the other half was not good. So 3.5.
I think we're all on the same page here. 3.5 for me as well. I wanted to like this episode. I really did. I was very uncomfortable by the Chekhov rape scene. And it didn't feel like Kirk was stopping it because of what it was. That's, I think, what disturbed me the most. I get that there was an alien driving brutality between these two crews. I just think even in 1968, that felt wrong. And I'm not saying you can't do stuff like that on TV. Lord knows every episode of Law and Order SVU is basically that. I just feel like it comes off so much more creepy because it's Chekhov. And we know Chekhov from the movies. So, like, you know, at the time, maybe it was different, but I look at Chekhov, he's kind of plucky. He seems very nice. And he just comes across as a genuinely good person. And then you get this, and that just like immediately, that one scene kind of ruined this whole episode for me.
Would you have been more comfortable, real quick on this? What if it had been just for the episode, an anonymous red shirt type? I mean, I don't think that justifies the ugliness of the scene still. I think you're right on that the whole scene itself, no matter who's doing the aggressive, it feels off and it feels wrong. But would we have been even a slightly more like, oh, it's Ensign, whatever, Dexter from, engineering, who suddenly like, and it's like the guy when the Kirk confronts him, he says, "Get back to sickbay." "No, sir, I'm gonna." And then I don't remember if he gets decked or stabbed or whatever happens to that guy. But I'm just wondering if, because it's Chekhov and we like Walter Koenig so much, like, is that part of this?
I mean, yeah. Honestly, I think I would have felt a little bit better about Kirk interrupting a red shirt about to do something horrible than Chekhov.
Right.
I think that would have been a little bit better for me. I still wouldn't have liked it necessarily, right, but it kind of reminds me of what they did with Voyager with, and spoiler alert, when we get to Voyager, we'll talk about this episode because it was absolutely stellar, with the murderer on board.
Right.
And having somebody like that in a Starfleet uniform is like, how did this happen? Well, the truth of the matter is, like, that still happens. Like, there is still crime in the Federation. So, like, I get that, like, there are people who, especially when they're under the influence of an alien presence, like, that would happen. But I hate to go back to wrestling, but when you have a baby face, you got to protect your baby face. Like, they can't do stuff like this because that cheapens the character. It kills the character. And there are a couple of times in this season, in the season, but in the series, where they kind of take Chekhov, who's built up as this sort of like cute baby face type character, they just make him a creep. And I know he's Russian, and of course, Cold War, that's probably why they did it. But I feel like that was not Roddenberry's vision.
Right.
And I know, like, there's a lot of stuff that Roddenberry would have never done. And it's like, I'm glad they did that stuff. And we'll talk about that in future series. But this in particular is like, that really just comes across as absolutely counterproductive to what I think they were trying to do with the show. And that's my biggest problem.
That's an excellent point, and I'm going to relate it to Twin Peaks because Fert Derby and I have had this discussion before. It's like when the showrunner or the creator is away, like the other writers just, I don't know if they're like, oh, I'm going to experiment with this today, or they just go off the rails. but it's kind of like when Lynch was away from, was it season 2 at one point there, Fert? The storylines were just, I'm like, what are you doing with some of these characters and what are you thinking? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And then it's like the showrunners got to come back at the end, like Lynch did for the last episode. I think season 2 or season 2.5, and corrects all the issues from before. That's what gets frustrating, which is kind of like what we were talking about with Mandalorian a little bit, and on our other amazing show. It's like, what happens where it just loses all sense of itself? And to address your question of whether it's Chekhov or someone else, it's just weird all around.
Yeah.
I mean, why? To make a statement, to be the writer who's kind of out there, testing the limits. It's like, no, it's just, it's poop either way is what it is. I mean,
it just doesn't fit. So yeah, 3.5 I think is a solid. I wouldn't steer somebody away from watching this episode, but it's certainly among the episodes where it's like, if you didn't watch this one, it might not be worth rehashing.
We forgive you. Yeah.
It's no alternative factor.
No.
But it's rough. It's rough. Well, that in consideration, until next time, as we re-embark on this 5-year mission, we leave this unresolved as a crew of Klingons aboard the Enterprise and say to you, live long and prosper.